9. Marriage and banishment. During the lively years of his first public struggles, Marx also had to contend with a number of domestic difficulties. He always referred to them unwillingly and only when unpleasant necessity compelled him to. In direct contrast with the pitiful lot of the Philistine who can forget God and the world in his own petty troubles, it had been given to Marx to raise himself above his bitterest troubles in the great affairs of mankind. Unfortunately, his life offered him all too frequent opportunity for exercising this power. We find his attitude to such matters expressed in a very characteristic fashion in the first utterance concerning his paltry private affairs which has come down to us. Writing to Rouhet on July 9, 1842, to excuse himself for not having sent in the contributions he had promised for the anecdota, he mentions a number of difficulties and then declares, "The remaining time was wasted and upset by the most unpleasant family controversies. Although quite well off, my family has put difficulties in my way which have temporarily placed me in most embarrassing circumstances. I cannot possibly bother you with a description of these paltry private affairs, and it is really fortunate that the state of our public affairs makes it impossible for any man of character to let his private troubles irritate him. This is one of the many indications of that unusual strength of character which has always enraged the Philistines, with their irritability in matters private, against the heartless Marx. No details have become known about these most unpleasant family controversies, and Marx referred to them again only on one occasion, and even then only very generally, when the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher were about to be launched. Writing to Rouhet, he declared that as soon as their plans had taken on a more definite form he would go to Kreuznach, where the mother of his future wife had gone to live after the death of her husband, get married there and spend some time in the house of his mother-in-law, because we must have a certain amount of material ready before we start work. I can assure you without any romanticism, that I am head over heels and in all seriousness in love. We have been engaged now for over 7 years, and my future wife has had to fight hard struggles on my behalf, partly against her pious aristocratic relatives who regard their Father in heaven and the government in Berlin as equal objects of veneration, and partly against my own family, in which a number of clerical individuals and other enemies of mine have got a hold. And these struggles have almost undermined her health. For years therefore my future wife and I have been compelled to engage in unnecessary and exhausting conflicts. More so in fact than many people 3 times our age who are always talking about their experience of life. Apart from these rather vague indications, we know nothing of the difficulties of the engagement period. Not without trouble, but comparatively quickly, the arrangements for the issue of the new publication were made without Marx having to go to Leipzig. After Rouhet, who was well-to-do, had declared himself ready to put up $6,000 as a shareholder in the Literarisches Kontor, Froebel agreed to undertake the publishing. Marx was promised a salary of $500 as editor, and with these prospects he married his Jenny on the 19th of June, 1843. It still remained to decide whether Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher should be published, and the choice was between Brussels, Paris, and Strasbourg. The young pair would have preferred the Alsatian capital, but finally the decision was taken in favor of Paris after both Rouhet and Froebel had visited Paris and Brussels and made various inquiries. In Brussels the press had more elbow room than in Paris, with its provision for the deposit of bond and its September laws, but the French capital was in closer touch with German life. And Rouhet wrote encouragingly that with 3,000 francs or perhaps a little more Marx would be able to live quite comfortably there. In accordance with his plans, Marx spent the first few months of his married life in the house of his mother-in-law, and in November moved his fledgling household to Paris. The last documentary evidence of his early life in Germany is a letter written to Feuerbach on October 23, 1843, asking him for a contribution to the first issue of the new Jahrbucher, preferably a criticism of Schelling. I feel myself almost justified in assuming from your introduction to the second edition of The Essence of Christianity that you have something in store for this windbag. That would be a fine debut, don't you think? How cleverly Herr Schelling has succeeded in deceiving the French, first the feeble and eclectic Cousin, and later on even the brilliant Leroux. Pierre Leroux and his associates still regard Schelling as the man who put reasonable realism in the place of transcendental idealism, ideas of flesh and blood in the place of abstract ideas, world philosophy in the place of formal philosophy. You would therefore render our publication a great service and the cause of truth a still greater one if you gave us a characterization of Schelling for our first issue. You are just the man for the job because you are the exact opposite of Schelling. He had for the realization of the honest ideas of his youth. We are entitled to believe the best of our opponents. No other means but imagination, no other energy but vanity, no other motive force but opium, no other organ but an irritable and effeminate receptivity. In him these ideas always remained a fantastic youthful dream, but in you they have become truth, reality and manly gravity. I regard you therefore as the necessary and natural opponent of Schelling, appointed by the twin powers of nature and history. How amiable is the tone of this letter, and at the same time how delighted is its author at the prospect of a great struggle. But Feuerbach hesitated. He had, indeed, praised the venture to Ruhe, but now he refused to assist it. Even an appeal to his Gallo-Germanic principle had not moved him. It was, above all, his writings which had aroused the ire of the authorities and caused them to bludgeon out of existence what still remained of philosophic freedom in Germany, thus compelling the philosophical opposition to leave the country unless it was prepared to capitulate miserably. Feuerbach himself was not the man to capitulate, but at the same time he was unable to summon up sufficient courage to plunge into the breakers which surged around the dead land of Germany. Feuerbach's reply to the fiery words with which Marx sought to win him was friendly and interested, but it was nevertheless a refusal. It was a black day in his life, and from then on his isolation gradually became an intellectual one also.